To move. Is that this motion be agreed to?
My Lords, I begin by thanking the Noble Earl of Caithness for securing this debate and introducing it so comprehensively. And it's a great pleasure to follow the Noble Lord, with whom I share a considerable passion for soil health and soil quality, something that we've often discussed. And I would agree in some respects with the Noble Lord's diagnosis of why we are one of the most nature-depleted corners of this battered planet. The Common Agricultural Policy is something the Green Party right across the EU has very much led in opposition to, although we have to note that if you look at other parts of the EU, the way in which it was applied seems to have been particularly poor in the UK in terms of our environmental and biodiversity outcomes. However, I think it is important that we add in other causes to the problem, and the way in which the government needs to take a comprehensive approach in terms of policy. Just this week, we had a debate in the other place following a very strong public backing of the petition to get fair about farming. And we have a huge dominance in our food system of giant multinational companies, of a handful of companies that dominate in areas such as factory farming of chickens. And that dominance of those companies has forced our farmers, has squeezed their margins and forced our farmers into systems of farming that have done huge damage to the natural world. And I would put it to the Noble Lord the Minister that we're talking about the SFI, the government's support approach today, that the government also needs to take action from the other side of making sure that farmers are indeed allowed to manage the land in the way they would like to manage their land. I think it's also important that in this debate we look at the other context of which the government has been doing trade deals, in which it's letting into the UK food with standards considerably below the standards that we ask environmentally and animal welfare standards. And all of these things are actually acting against what the government is putting money into through its farming programs, and these things have to be seen together. And I think I'll continue on that theme of the need for a systems approach. We are in a climate emergency and nature crisis. We've exceeded 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries as identified by the Stockholm Institute. And if you look at the British countryside, that's where you can really see that happening. And we don't talk about it nearly much as we probably should, but the UN last year was pointing out that globally we have more problems with plastics in our soils than we actually have in our oceans, something there has been a great deal of attention to. And I was tempted, since we're talking about biodiversity in general in the terms of the Noble Earl's debate, to raise the issue of the biodiversity of our soils and the research that's been happening in basically the last year, that's really started to realise how much we are losing the biodiversity of the microbiome of the soil. But I'm aware the Noble Lord the Minister is new, so I'm going to be kind and not push too far down this road today, but he can expect more of it in future. But I wanted to shift now to the overall view of ELMS and what impact it's going to have on the targets of the Environment Act. And I'm sure many Noble Lords have seen an excellent briefing from the Green Alliance that really digs into this issue. And it notes that the Agricultural Transition Plan update that came out this month doesn't provide evidence of how the actions being encouraged by the update are actually going to impact on targets. We need to actually see how these are joined up together. These are the Environment Act targets on biodiversity which the government is legally committed to. Yet how do these two things relate to each other? We're not actually seeing the explanation, the figures, the setting out of that link. We've got a list of schemes that will contribute to supposedly delivering the targets, but we don't know how or how much. And we're not also seeing an evaluation of how much progress has actually been made. And is what's being suggested in this update enough to get us to where we're supposed to get to by 2030? And even where there's some detail, it didn't relate the action to what's currently included in the ELMS schemes. For example, in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest single measure identified in the plan is to use FFI to reduce emissions through methane-suppressing feed additives for livestock. Yet the use of methane suppressants, however much I might question that, is not incentivised through any ELMS scheme. And of course, Your Lordship's House, the entire country is acutely aware of the issues of the state of many of our rivers, and focus has tended to be on the issue of sewage and water companies. But what's happening in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment pollution from agriculture is a big part of the issues of the River Wye, many issues in many rivers in East Anglia. The Office for Environmental Protection says the scale of reductions needed to meet the targets in the Environment Act may require up to 100% of farmers to adopt nature-friendly farming methods. Now, that's, as the Noble Earl said, we're at the moment at 10% of those measures. We've got a huge gap here, which is really not being set out. Now, I think, again, looking at the context in which we're talking today, of course we have to focus on the recent report from the Office for Environmental Protection, which really, I think, has to be described fairly as scathing. And it acknowledges there's been some progress made in the implementation of the ELMS scheme, but says its rollout needs to be vastly accelerated. And the OEP is saying overall that it's keeping in reserve the possibility of taking legal action against the government for failing to deliver on its legally binding targets. And that's the context in which we're in. Now, because we're particularly focused on biodiversity, I want to welcome the fact, and I'll be positive here, that among the 50 new environmental actions that the government's introduced are agroforestry and restoring water bodies and watercourses, and I think to some degree at least ponds and mires, which is a really important area that's not got sufficient attention. And a suggestion to the Noble Lord the Minister: if the Noble Lord has not visited Wakelands Agroforestry in Suffolk, I would strongly recommend visiting there, because if you want to see a long-term agroforestry scheme in action, delivering what's visibly and obviously a wonderful level of biodiversity and a wonderful level of productivity and additional diversity in the human diet, I would really encourage the Noble Lord to look at that. But I think agroforestry is an area, and I'm declare an interest, I suppose, as having a fellowship with the Horticultural Trade Association. Of course, one of the things we need for agroforestry is ideally a supply of locally grown trees from nurseries here in the UK. And so perhaps the Noble Lord the Minister can comment on how we're going to ensure that if we're going forward with this agroforestry, we can have locally grown trees suitable for local conditions happening all around the country, ideally, of course, native species, while making appropriate adjustment for the impact of the changing environment of the climate emergency. The other thing I wanted to look at was the enhancing water bodies and watercourses. And I'd be interested in any thoughts the Noble Lord the Minister might have about the restoration of ponds and mires, because, of course, what we've seen with the industrial agriculture, the flattening of hedges, the large fields that we've seen, the way we've administered CAP has encouraged, is, of course, we've seen huge amounts of filling in of ponds, which are absolutely crucial to biodiversity. Now, we've seen, particularly in East Anglia, there's some really exciting developments whereby old ponds are being excavated, carefully done by expert ecologists, done in the right way. What they're finding is that actually the seed banks still remain there, and in those ponds, sometimes species we thought were totally been lost for an area, are actually recovering because they're there. We've just got to give them the air and the light and the capacity to flourish and the moisture there. So is the government doing enough? Is it providing the kind of advice and support that farmers need for this kind of restoration, at which we need to see at a large scale, which also, of course, has huge benefits in terms of we're thinking about flooding and slow the flow? This is a really important measure from that side of impact benefit as well. Now, I'm afraid I come to a section where I'm afraid I'm going to entirely disagree with the Noble Earl about predator control. And I'm drawing here on the briefing from the Wildlife and Countryside Link. And it says we're going to talk about the funding of management of wild species that prey on farmland birds. And Wildlife and Countryside Link says, and I agree with them, that this is a distraction from the core objectives of the scheme. As confirmed in the State of Nature report of 2023, the decline in the abundance of farmland birds is primarily due to an increase in intensive farming practices, not natural predation. Predators are a marginal factor in farmland bird species abundance, and this only applies to a few species. Now, I do accept the RSPB studies that the Noble Earl questioned, but I would also go broader than this and point out, of course, that why in some areas do we have such an abundance of predators? It is, of course, one of the key factors, which has become increasingly highlighted in recent years, is the massive release of large amounts of game birds, particularly pheasants. What we're talking about is a slow, non-native, not very well adapted to our environment feast for our predators. And then we have lots of predator numbers. And now we are going to, having released those pheasants into our natural environment, what we are then going to do is fund farmers to do predator control. I think there's a very obvious alternative there, which is to stop or at least massively reduce the amount of release of food into the environment, and then you will have fewer predators. And we might also have some bit more safety on our roads as well, as an aside. What we need to do, what we're looking here is, again, we're talking about looking at this in a systemic way. What does our entire countryside look like? And that's where I have to raise the issue of the land use framework, something long awaited, something which was dealt with at considerable length and detail and quality by a committee of your Lordship's House, that we need to actually have a vision of what the countryside should look like. And that needs to be a holistic vision that's guiding the whole ELMS and SFI schemes. And what we're really lacking is that overall long-term strategy. And so I come, in terms of briefings, also pointing to the Nature Friendly Farming Network briefing prepared for this. And that very much majors on and focuses on the need for a long-term strategy. What we seem to be doing is offering some money for this, offering some money for that scheme. But where's the picture of what the countryside looks like? And we know what the vision of the countryside has been over the past few decades. It's been farms getting bigger and bigger, fields getting bigger and bigger, grubbing out hedges, getting rid of trees. That was the vision. Now we're starting to establish a vision where we acknowledge we need to restore the hedges, we need to bring back trees, we need a different kind of environment. Yet we're still a long way from looking at the kind of crop diversity, genuine diversity, not just 2 or 3 crops on a farm, but scores of different crops on a farm. And I come back to Wakelands as a vision of what I would say is the Green Party's vision for what our countryside could look like and how rich that it could be. We need to be looking at this in a holistic kind of way. Now, I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to come to one specific point, because I think hopefully this debate might be a useful way of settling a debate that's been carried on in the media. Because as part of the rollout of these schemes, the government said it would maintain the annual farming budget for England at £2.4 billion a year. However, The Guardian has looked at DEFRA figures and concluded there was an underspend of £110 million in 21-22 and £117 million in 22-23. Now, the government has said that those figures are untrue. It would be useful if the Noble Lord the Minister could explain, set out in a little bit of detail, as time allows today, and really say from the dispatch box if he believes that that promise of spending has been met.